Hello and welcome to GreenBiz Studio. I'm Grant Harrison, Director for Sustainable Finance and ESG with GreenBiz Group, and I'm excited to be speaking today with Roger Bottum, SVP of Product at VelocityEHS. Roger, it's a pleasure to have you here with us.
Great to be here today. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, Roger, you are well aware from the vantage point your role affords you that the need to measure and track climate data, particularly greenhouse gas emissions, is increasing, and the stakes for getting it right are too. Many companies are understandably just getting started with the ESG journey that we talk about, and many of those companies would, of course, be starting that journey with greenhouse gas emissions tracking. What advice would you give these early journey companies about where best to start?
Thank you for that question. It really helps to think about greenhouse gas emissions as not just tracking, but as accounting. So greenhouse gas emissions tracking is really seen as financial data, and investor grade reporting on a company's GHG emissions is really quickly becoming mainstream. And so that means GHG tracking data must be produced with accuracy and is verifiable, as the company's liable for the data they report. And so to start, companies should look to the accounting standard, the equivalent of the accounting standard in this area, which is the GHG protocol, and as corporate and value chain standards. And the good news is that all the major ESG disclosure standards base their GHG accounting on the GHG protocol standards. So getting it right under the GHG protocol standards really puts you in a great position.
And it sounds like there would be a lot of value chain visibility one would need to be able to track, account for, as you mentioned, manage greenhouse gas emissions with accuracy, with the necessary accuracy. Can you tell us a bit about how someone could go about getting that level of insight that's required?
Yeah, so the way these things are split up is by scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. And first of all, you obviously need to get a good handle on the direct or scope 1 emissions that your operations generate. And then you also need to get a handle on the scope 2 emissions, which are really associated with purchased utility energy. And this very much connects to energy management, because you're going to need accurate information about your sources of energy and energy consumption. Scope 3 is where you start engaging stakeholders, both inside and outside your company, and especially your value chain partners. So even more than scope 1 and 2, it's not just about collecting data at scale and efficiently, though that's a critical aspect, but there's also an increased need to address managing the data to ensure its completeness and its accuracy. And one key point on the value chain, a great place to start is a materiality assessment. And a materiality assessment is a way to build and tap into that engagement. It's a prioritization of the issues that matter most. And a materiality assessment is really a tool to gather this information, really in the form of a specifically designed survey that you give to your stakeholders.
Great. And I want to go back to the first question I asked you. You mentioned standards, disclosure standards. I promised myself I would stop saying alphabet soup, but I just said it, so I'm going to reference it. The sustainability ESG space has a large alphabet soup. A lot of those are disclosure frameworks and standards. It looks like the soup is diminishing a bit as time passes, which is great. But it's a very active and quickly evolving topic. Can you talk a little bit about those standards, maybe which of them are or are likely set to be mandatory disclosures, and maybe why they're important to understand in this space?
I think the alphabet soup comment is well earned. I think at times for any of us, even those of us in this space, it takes the magic decoder ring at times, particularly the plethora of acronyms. So certainly appreciate that. I think the simple message is we're seeing the shift from disclosures being mostly voluntary to increasingly being written into regulatory requirements. So just maybe a little bit of the background on the voluntary side, the formation of the International Sustainability Standards Board, here's an alphabet soup, ISSB, a little over a year ago has been an important step in the evolution of the voluntary disclosures. because they're trying to bring more reliability to disclosures and consolidation of some of the disclosure frameworks that already existed. So this is a great advantage to organizations starting their journey now. For example, all of the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, SASB, standards are now under the oversight of ISSB, and ISSB is now moving ahead with finalizing its own 2 draft ESG standards. We also just recently learned that CDP will incorporate ISSB's IFRS 2 disclosure standard requirements into its global environmental disclosure platform. And that means that 17,000 voluntary users of the CDP standard will disclose data structured to that standard in 2024. So if your company follows that, you're in a good place to be. But we're also seeing regulatory requirements for disclosures now, as you know, and there's been a lot happening there just in the last year in 2022. So in the US, the SEC issued a proposed rule earlier in the year to require all publicly traded companies to disclose data about their GHG emissions. And the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group, EFRAG, issued a number of draft standards last year that would create mandatory disclosure requirements, including on climate, for about 50,000 European companies. So business leaders affected by these regulations really need to understand the requirements and to start preparing.
So those sustainability disclosure standards, like you mentioned, SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, industry-specific standards, wide-ranging kind of difference between what is material or relevant in terms of sustainability, risk or impact per industry, but one kind of common thread across is specifically greenhouse gas emissions reporting. What kind of reporting should companies be doing specifically on that front, just around GHG emissions?
Sure. So actually, let me touch on specifically the impact of, I think the SEC regulations will be relevant to a lot of the listeners on this piece. And it really, at first blush, it requires public companies to disclose their GHG data across Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. And while that proposal is for public companies, if you're a private company, it doesn't mean you're not going to also be forced to act, because by definition, public companies' Scope 3 emissions are another company's Scope 1 and Scope 2. So the value chain here will be leveraged by these regulations. If you're a private company and you provide goods and services to a public company who must report their GHGs, you're going to be asked by that customer to provide insight into your own emissions. And so on top of that, then, of course, pressure from customers, from the general public, from financial institutions, and even from insurers will all exert pressure onto companies to provide insight into their carbon emissions, and in turn to make decisions whether to engage with that business or not based on those results. So I think we'll see all organizations having to address Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions here.
I appreciate that adage that by definition, somebody's Scope 3 means it's your Scope 1 and 2. Even if, as you're mentioning, you're not a large public company that's prioritized in the SEC regulation, eventually disclosure of sustainability information, in particular greenhouse gas emissions, will kind of be the price of admission to capital markets in some ways. Curious, Roger, if you have any other final thoughts you want to offer the GreenBiz studio here before we sign off.
Sure. I think with one word, automation. Those of your listeners or our listeners that lived through the Sarbanes-Oxley era will remember the first couple of years of that and how painful it was for many organizations. And really the way that companies got on top of that was automation of those key processes. So this all starts with getting accurate data, just as you would with your financial data, and getting accurate GHG data and running an effective program really requires automation. Otherwise, you could be focused on the wrong priorities and reporting and making incorrect decisions based on the bad data. Good news, as anyone's probably aware, There are a lot of off-the-shelf tools that stand ready to help you jumpstart and sustain your program. A couple things that I would recommend is, first of all, make sure you're focused on the right thing so you can make it easy to perform and use materiality assessments. Ideally, rather than starting from scratch, building them from predefined menus of ESG topics, engaging and aligning stakeholders through a materiality matrix. Two, for scope one, particularly for an industrial company, particularly heavy industry, you're going to want to look for opportunities to leverage ESG together with environmental compliance. So air, water, and waste reporting to be accurate and efficient. And for scope two, also because retrieving and organizing utility data needed can be a huge manual and error-prone process. Many organizations are prioritizing automated utility integration capabilities to pull billing data straight from providers to ensure data integrity, automatically apply the correct emission factors, and convert that data to the units that you need and generate reports aligned with the major disclosure frameworks. So, to summarize that, as an ESG leader, the more time you spend on automating the right things and reducing busy work, the more time your team can spend on making decisions and engaging internal and external stakeholders.
Automation, accuracy, action, those all sound like quite deeply intertwined to get off to a good, successful start on this ESG journey that is increasingly, as we've talked about, compelled by regulation, stakeholder demands. The momentum is not stopping. So I'm looking forward to keeping an eye on VelocityEHS's support for companies making their way in this space. It is certainly a dynamic and increasingly important one to be on top of. And you have just heard from Roger Bottum, SVP of Product at VelocityEHS here in the GreenBiz studio. Thank you for joining us, Roger, and looking forward to keeping in touch.